Have you ever wanted to disappear just to finally feel peace? Liam Brooks wasn't anyone special. At 41, he was the kind of man people only noticed when something broke: a stuck elevator, a burst pipe, a heater dying in the middle of a Chicago winter. As maintenance supervisor for a large residential building on the north side, he spent his days fixing other people's problems and his nights lying awake, wondering why his own mind never seemed to shut off. He'd carried the same thought since he was 17. One day, I'll have peace. Back then, peace meant silence. The kind where his father wasn't drunk and screaming, his mother wasn't crying in the kitchen, and his younger brother wasn't getting suspended from school again. Liam had learned early that if he stayed calm, if he fixed things quietly, if he never asked for anything, the chaos would hurt less. It worked well enough to get him through. The problem was, that role had followed him into adulthood like a shadow he couldn't shake. His marriage to Natalie, a public school teacher, had crumbled not because of fights or betrayal, but because of his suffocating absence and presence. She'd told him once, near the end, "You're always here, Liam, but you're never actually here." He helped with everything: groceries, repairs, bills, but never spoke about what he felt, never said no, never showed up as anything more than a helpful ghost. The divorce was civil on paper. Inside, it gutted him. He left their shared apartment with a duffel bag, an old couch, and the growing conviction that somewhere out there existed a place where he could finally rest. Late at night, he'd scroll through videos about off-grid living, tiny cabins in Montana, men who'd left everything behind to find silence. Between videos, his heart would race. His back ached constantly. Sleep came in fragments. He told himself it was just stress, just temporary. But deep down, he knew he wasn't looking for peace. He was looking for erasure. The breaking point came on an ordinary Tuesday. After a 14-hour shift dealing with a flooded basement and 3 separate tenant complaints, Liam stopped at a convenience store near midnight to grab something for his headache. His phone rang 3 times in under a minute. The building manager complaining about unsatisfied residents, his brother asking for emergency money, his mother leaving a tearful voice message about how lonely she felt. Standing in the fluorescent-lit aisle, Liam felt his chest tighten, his ears ring, his hands go clammy. He dropped the medicine box, walked to his car, and sat there in the parking lot feeling like he was being crushed from the inside out. It wasn't a dramatic panic attack. It was quieter than that. It was the feeling of being completely out of space within himself. The next morning, after another sleepless night, he made an appointment at the neighborhood clinic asking for something strong to help me sleep. The doctor, a middle-aged man named Dr. Harris, listened carefully and instead of immediately writing a prescription, asked a simple question. When was the last time you went a full day without solving someone else's problem? Liam couldn't answer. Dr. Harris ran some basic tests, explained chronic stress, and how a body in constant alert mode stops knowing how to rest, and yes, prescribed something for emergencies. But before ending the appointment, he pointed to a small flyer on the wall, a free 8-week program at a community library called Spaces of Silence, run by a local nonprofit for people experiencing emotional exhaustion. It wasn't a spiritual retreat or loud self-help group. It was something simpler. Liam thought it sounded a little too soft, but he kept the flyer in his pocket. He only signed up a week later, in the middle of the night, after catching himself typing "how to disappear without hurting family" into Google and feeling genuinely scared of himself. He didn't want to vanish. He wanted to stop feeling crushed. The library meeting room was modest. Folding chairs arranged in a circle, a small table with tea and crackers, fluorescent lights humming overhead. Liam arrived 10 minutes late on purpose, hoping to slip into the back unnoticed. But there were only 5 people total, and the facilitator, a woman in her late 50s with silver-streaked black hair pulled into a low bun, looked up and smiled at him like she'd been expecting him all along. Her name was Grace Nakamura, a retired ICU nurse who'd spent decades watching people live and die under fluorescent lights much harsher than these. She spoke softly, moved slowly, but her presence filled the room in a way Liam couldn't explain. She didn't quote scripture or talk about vibrations or use any of the language he'd learned to distrust. Instead, she told stories from the hospital, patients who died peacefully and others who died fighting until the very end. And then she said something that stuck with him. The ones who left in peace weren't the ones with fewer problems. They were the ones who'd made peace with who they actually were. The group was small: a rideshare driver named Marcus, a single mother named Keisha, an exhausted middle school teacher named Priya, and Liam. Grace made it clear from the start that this wasn't about becoming monks or transcending reality. It was about learning 3 simple practices. A daily 2-minute pause to notice the body without trying to fix it. A simple truth journal where each person wrote not to-do lists, but things they'd stop pretending not to see. 1 difficult conversation per month, chosen consciously, where the person showed up more honestly than usual. Liam's first instinct was skepticism. During the first few sessions, he spent more time imagining himself alone on some rural road than actually paying attention. But something kept him coming back. Maybe it was Grace's unshakable calm. Maybe it was the way the others spoke about their exhaustion without shame. Or maybe it was the fact that, for the first time in years, no one needed anything from him. By the 3rd week, he started actually doing the 2-minute pauses. At first, they were unbearable. His mind immediately filled with lists, worries, echoes of old arguments. But he stuck with it, sitting on the fire escape at work or in his truck after a shift, just noticing his breath, his heartbeat, the tightness in his shoulders. And in the journal, he began writing sentences that frightened him. I resent my mother for treating me like a substitute husband. I say yes to everyone because I'm terrified of being thrown away. I've been so busy trying to keep everyone comfortable that I forgot what I actually want. He didn't share these with the group at first, but Grace had a way of asking questions that reached past his defenses. One evening, she gave everyone an exercise. Describe in detail your perfect day of peace, but pay attention not just to what's present, but what's absent. When Liam's turn came, he described a cabin in Montana, snow outside, no phone ringing, no one knocking, just him and absolute silence. Grace listened, nodding gently, and then asked with surgical kindness, "In your vision of peace, is there anyone you love?" The question caught him completely off guard. He realized that in his dream of disappearing, there was no mother, no brother, no ex-wife, no friends. Just him and the void. Grace continued, "Maybe you're not looking for peace, Liam. Maybe you're looking for anesthesia." That sentence was the first deep crack in everything he'd believed. He'd always thought peace meant removing everyone and everything from the picture. For the first time, he considered that maybe peace could include people, noise, responsibility. That maybe it came from how he positioned himself within his life, not from escaping it entirely. Liam started applying the practices outside the library walls, and it was harder than he'd expected. The 2-minute pauses made him realize his body was never truly relaxed, not even in sleep. The journal forced him to see patterns he'd been avoiding for decades. And the idea of a difficult conversation terrified him more than any emergency repair at 3 in the morning. At work, he began noticing how often he said yes before people even finished asking. How he stayed late not because the work required it, but because he couldn't stand the thought of letting someone down. How he ate lunch in his truck instead of the break room, because being alone felt safer than risking conflict. The building manager once called him at 11 p.m. demanding he come fix a tenant's clogged sink right now. And for the first time, Liam said, "I'll be there first thing tomorrow morning." The silence on the other end was deafening. He expected to be fired. Instead, the manager just said, "Okay," and hung up. The world didn't collapse. But Liam's hands shook for an hour afterward. At the next session, Grace introduced a new idea. The difference between boundaries and walls. A wall says, "You can't come near me," she explained. A boundary says, "You can come close, but not past this line." She told a story about a patient in the ICU whose family insisted on extreme measures even though he was clearly suffering. The nurses had to set a boundary. They would provide care with dignity, but they wouldn't participate in torture disguised as hope. The family was angry at first, Grace said. But later, some of them thanked us. Because we held the line they couldn't hold themselves. Liam thought about all the lines he'd never drawn. How he'd let his mother's emotional storms flood into every corner of his life. How he'd carried his brother's failures like they were his own. How he'd agreed to things that made him sick inside just to avoid the guilt of saying no. Grace's words echoed. We held the line they couldn't hold themselves. Maybe that's what love actually looked like. Not endless accommodation, but enough self-respect to stop betraying yourself for someone else's comfort. He knew what his difficult conversation had to be. His brother, Evan, had called 2 weeks ago saying he'd been fired again and needed to crash for a while. His mother had followed up with a barrage of texts. You know how sensitive your brother is. You can't turn him away. The building manager was pressuring Liam to take on extra shifts because of budget cuts. Everything was converging at once, and the old Liam would have just absorbed it all, gotten sicker, and fantasized about running. But this time, something was different. This time, he had 2 minutes of space inside himself. This time, he had words in a journal that told the truth. This time, he wasn't alone. Grace asked each person to commit to their difficult conversation within the next 2 weeks. Liam nodded slowly, feeling his stomach turn, and said out loud for the first time, I'm going to talk to my mom and brother. Together. And I'm going to stop pretending I can save everyone. Grace never positioned herself as a guru or healer. She was just a woman who'd seen thousands of people at their most vulnerable and learned what mattered in the end. In one session, she brought in a small wooden box and placed it in the center of the circle. This belonged to a patient I cared for 20 years ago, she said. He was a CEO, very successful, very stressed. Had a heart attack at 52. When he woke up in the ICU, the first thing he asked me wasn't about his business or his family. He asked, did I waste my life? The room went silent. Grace opened the box. Inside was a folded piece of paper with a single sentence written in shaky handwriting. I spent my whole life earning love I already had. He wrote this 3 days before he died, Grace said. He asked me to keep it and share it with anyone who needed to hear it. I think that's all of us. Liam felt the words land in his chest like a stone. I spent my whole life earning love I already had. That was exactly what he'd been doing. Running himself into the ground to prove he was worthy of being kept. Grace looked at him, really looked at him, and said, Liam, what would it feel like to stop earning and just be? He didn't have an answer. But over the following week, he carried that question everywhere. What would it feel like to stop performing? To stop being the eternal fixer? To exist without apologizing for taking up space? The idea was so foreign it felt like learning a new language. But it also felt like the first true thing anyone had asked him in years. During their one-on-one check-in before his planned conversation, Grace asked him another question. What are you afraid will happen if you set a boundary? Liam exhaled slowly. That they'll stop loving me. That I'll be alone. That I'll realize I was only valuable because I was useful. Grace nodded. And what if you set the boundary and they do get angry? What if they do pull away for a while? Liam felt his throat tighten. Then I'll know it was never real. Grace's eyes softened. Or you'll know that real love can survive honesty. Sometimes people need time to adjust to the truth. That doesn't mean you were wrong to speak it. She handed him a small card with a single sentence written on it. Peace isn't when no one is disappointed in you. Peace is when you stop betraying yourself to keep everyone comfortable. Keep this with you, she said. When it gets hard, read it. You're not doing this to hurt anyone. You're doing this to stop hurting yourself. The dinner was set for a Sunday evening at his mother's house. The same house where he'd grown up, where the couch still sagged in the same spot, where the TV was always too loud. Liam arrived with his heart pounding and his hands cold. His mother, Marianne, greeted him at the door with her usual combination of affection and complaint. His brother, Evan, was already on the couch scrolling through his phone, looking both defensive and entitled in a way that made Liam's jaw tighten. They sat down to eat, and within 5 minutes, Marianne launched into her familiar script. The bills were piling up. Her health was getting worse. She didn't know what she'd do without Liam's help. Then she turned to Evan and sighed dramatically. "Your brother's job situation is harder than we thought," she said, as if Liam wasn't sitting right there. "He's going to need a place to stay for a while. I told him you'd help." Evan didn't even look up from his plate. Before, Liam would have swallowed hard and said he'd figure it out. This time, he felt his whole body start to shake. He remembered the 2-minute pause. He put down his fork, felt the chair beneath him, noticed his breath moving in and out. And instead of rushing to fix the tension, he let the silence stretch just a few seconds longer than usual. It was uncomfortable. It was real. Then, with his voice a little unsteady, he said something he'd never had the courage to say. "Mom, I love you. I love Evan, but I can't be the emergency plan for everyone for the rest of my life." The room froze. Evan's head snapped up. Marianne's face went pale, then red. "What are you talking about?" she said, her voice rising. "We're family. Family helps each other." Liam's heart was hammering, but he kept going. "I've been helping. For 20 years, I've been helping. But helping has turned into carrying, and I can't carry everyone anymore. I'm drowning." Evan stood up, his face twisted with anger. "So that's it? You're just going to be selfish now? Abandon us?" Liam felt the old guilt rising like a wave, the instinct to take it back, to smooth everything over. But then he remembered Grace's words. Real love can survive honesty. He stayed seated, kept his voice calm, and said, "I'm not abandoning anyone, but I can only help up to a point. Beyond that, you have to take responsibility for your own life, Evan. And Mom, you have to stop putting all your emotional weight on me. I'm your son, not your husband." Marianne started crying, saying she never expected this from him, that he was always the good one. Evan called him selfish, ungrateful, cold. The whole scene was brutal. There was no inspiring music, no perfect speech that made everyone understand. It was just messy and painful and real. But underneath the chaos, something was shifting. For the first time in his life, Liam was standing in his truth instead of contorting himself to fit everyone else's needs. He didn't yell. He didn't storm out. He just kept repeating, with increasing steadiness, "I can help this much. Beyond this, you need to take responsibility too." When he finally left that night, he felt sick, guilty, shaky. Part of him wanted to call and apologize, to take it all back. But when he lay down in bed, he noticed something he'd never felt before. The guilt was there, the fear was there, but his chest wasn't as tight. There was a tiny space inside him where air could move, where honesty lived. At the next library session, Liam walked in expecting judgment. Instead, Grace smiled with the tired tenderness of someone who'd seen this story 1,000 times. He told the group everything. The dinner, the yelling, the guilt, the shaking. When he finished, Marcus, the rideshare driver, said quietly, "Man, I wish I had the guts to do that." Keisha, the single mother, nodded. "I've been where your mom is. And you know what? Sometimes we need someone to tell us no. It's the only way we learn to stand on our own." Grace let the group talk for a while, and then she said something that would stay with Liam for the rest of his life. "You came here wanting to learn how to sleep better, how to get rid of the knot in your chest. But what you've discovered is much bigger than that. You've learned that peace doesn't come from removing everyone from your life. It comes from removing the lie that you have to betray yourself to be loved." Liam felt tears prick his eyes. He'd spent 41 years believing that his value came from how much he could endure, how much he could fix, how invisible he could make his own needs. And now, Sitting in a circle of equally exhausted strangers, he was learning that the peace he'd been searching for wasn't in Montana or solitude or silence. It was in the willingness to live aligned with his own truth, even when that truth made other people uncomfortable. Grace continued, "The people who love you for real will adjust. They might be angry at first because you've changed the rules, but if they truly love you and not just what you do, they'll find their way back. And the ones who don't, that's painful information, but it's also clarifying." Over the next few weeks, Liam kept up his practices. The 2-minute pauses became non-negotiable, even when work was chaos. The journal became a place where he could see his own patterns without judgment. And slowly, the world responded. Evan didn't talk to him for a month, but eventually called asking about a job lead. Marianne still called with complaints, but she also started leaning on her church group and a neighbor. The building manager stopped treating Liam like he was on call 24/7, because Liam had finally made it clear he wasn't. The most surprising thing was how much energy he had when he wasn't constantly managing everyone else's emotions. He started going to the gym twice a week. He read books for pleasure. He even went on a date with a woman from the building's 4th floor. Nothing serious, but enough to remind him that connection didn't have to mean self-erasure. And then Grace suggested something unexpected. "Would you want to help me co-facilitate a group for men? There are so many guys in this city who are drowning just like you were." Liam hesitated. He wasn't a therapist. He wasn't wise. But Grace shook her head. "You don't need to be. You just need to be someone who's been there and made it through. That's enough." 6 months later, Liam was still working at the same building, still fixing elevators and dealing with demanding tenants. But something fundamental had changed. He no longer saw every request as a test of his worth. He said no without guilt when he needed to. He took his lunch breaks. He asked for raises. He existed as a whole person instead of a tool. The men's group started meeting every other week at the library. It was small, a mix of janitors, delivery drivers, recently divorced dads, guys who were too nice for their own good. Liam didn't have all the answers, but he shared what he'd learned. The 2-minute pause, the truth journal, the difficult conversations. And Grace sat in sometimes, offering her quiet wisdom when the room got stuck. One evening, after a particularly heavy session where a man named David broke down talking about how his ex-wife had cheated on him and he still felt like it was his fault for not being enough, Liam found himself saying something he hadn't planned. "For a long time, I thought peace meant that nothing hurt anymore. That if I could just get far enough away from everyone, I'd finally feel okay. But that's not peace. That's just numbness. Real peace is being able to feel everything. The hurt, the fear, the love, and not abandoning yourself in the process." David looked up, his eyes red. "How do you do that?" Liam shrugged. "Honestly, I'm still figuring it out. But it starts with 2 minutes. Just 2 minutes where you stop fixing and start feeling. The rest builds from there." On a Sunday morning a few weeks later, Liam sat on a bench in a neighborhood park, watching kids play and couples walk by. His phone buzzed with messages. His mom asking about Thanksgiving plans, the building manager asking about a broken boiler, a friend inviting him to a Bears game. He looked at the screen, took a breath, and chose not to respond immediately. He set the phone beside him, rested his hands on his thighs, and watched his chest rise and fall. The world outside was still noisy. People still needed things. Problems still existed. But inside, there was a place where he wasn't at war with himself anymore. A place where he could say no without guilt, yes without resentment, and "I need time" without shame. He'd come to the library looking for escape. What he'd found instead was the courage to stop running. Grace had been right. Peace wasn't when no one was disappointed in him. Peace was when he stopped betraying himself to keep everyone else comfortable. And that peace, hard-won and imperfect, was something no cabin in Montana could ever give him. He only wanted peace. What he received was something far greater. The certainty that he no longer had to live at war with himself to be loved. This story reminds us that true peace isn't found in silence or solitude. It's found in the courage to stop betraying ourselves for someone else's comfort. Liam discovered that the peace he desperately sought wasn't in Montana or in escape. It was in finally learning to live aligned with his own truth. What boundary are you afraid to set today? Which relationship needs more honesty than comfort? If this story touched something deep within you, type the word peace in the comments. Let me know this message found you. Share what city you're watching from. Your story might inspire someone on their own journey. Subscribe and hit the bell because every week I share stories that can transform how you see yourself and your struggles. And remember, your transformation might be just one honest moment away.